Thanks, Micah, and thank you all. It seems like there's sort of two big questions as people look back on trying to make sense of 2012 and look ahead in this sort of area is people want to get a better handle on what the Obama campaign did, and people want to figure out if the Republicans can figure out how to catch up. And I think at the core of both of those questions is sort of an interest in how you innovate in campaigns. And so I want to sort of muse a little bit about this question of innovation in the world of campaigns. I think there's a sort of faulty assumption that a lot of folks in the media, in academia, even in the political world have, which is that candidate campaigns mark sort of the most sophisticated, intellectually robust institutions in the world of politics. In fact, I think it's sort of precisely the opposite. And so the question of how we get smarter about doing campaigns, how campaigns develop new tactics and tools, is actually specifically the story of people figuring out how to learn outside of campaigns themselves. When you think about it, a candidate campaign is really the worst company you could possibly imagine, right? So it's like, let's start a company and it's going to exist for 6 months or 9 months or maybe in some unique cases 18 months. They care only about winning market share on some random Tuesday in November. They're going to go out of business the next day regardless of whether they succeed or fail. The person who's the chairman or the CEO, the candidate, is somebody who either has done this before and usually thinks that they'll keep on doing the same thing that they did last time with the same people that made it work so well last time, or they've never done it, in which case there's absolutely no good reason why a county executive or a city council person or a well-intentioned civic-minded lawyer should have any idea how to oversee like a $2 million political marketing company when they're running for Congress. And so then they have to default to a sort of existing architecture of expertise, which tends to mean consulting firms, vendors, who often sort of circle around a new client in similar combinations to the way they'd worked before and tend to want to do the same thing that worked for them last time. But the consulting firms don't have any interest in getting smarter year to year, generally. Their incentives are all aligned with profit, and there's very rarely a punishment for failure. The candidate, the day after the election, very rarely is any reason to convene even a conference call to talk about what worked or what didn't, because they're either on to the work of governing or building a transition, or they're on a beach somewhere feeling sorry for themselves. And the job of a campaign manager or general consultant who's making decisions about allocating resources over the course of the campaign is not to figure out how to be smarter about politics, but figure out how to win an election. And anything that they did that would devote $1 or an hour or any other resource to sort of solving the broader questions of how we can improve our knowledge or develop new tools would be wasted. And so the story I tell in my book, which is basically about two innovations that have come into the world of politics, I think have been transformative in not just the sort of tactics of campaigns, but I think the sort of the intellectual milieu in which they take place, is about institutions other than candidate campaigns doing that difficult work. And I tell the story of two political scientists at Yale who, in 1998, go out on the streets of New Haven to run a field experiment, which is a pretty radical thing for political scientists at the time to do. And they were drawn to it not because they were particularly interested in making campaigns better, but because they were had been drawn into some fairly arcane theoretical disputes among political scientists and thought that they could sort of prove a point if they could, with small interactions, change an individual's likelihood of engaging in politics. And so they designed a randomized control trial. They set up a nonpartisan get out the vote drive with the local League of Women Voters chapters, and they randomly assigned New Haven voters into 4 groups, and a quarter of them got a pre-election reminder by mail on a postcard, or a quarter of them got a phone call from a call center. and a quarter got an in-person visit from a canvasser, mostly graduate students, and then a quarter were in a control group and got nothing at all. And then afterwards, you can go back and look at the voter rolls, and they realized that the people who got the phone call saw no increase in their likelihood of voting. The people who got the mails had a small but appreciable increase, and the people who got the in-person visit turned out at a significantly higher rate. They had trouble getting this published in academic journals. I think in my book I describe it as an embarrassingly practical insight. You know, and there was, in the world of political consultants who tend not to spend a lot of time reading academic journals, or reading at all in my experience, you know, there are sort of two responses to this, and one is, you know, like, oh great, academics have developed a scientifically credible tool for disentangling cause and effect, and with the sort of confidence of a pharmaceutical trial to understand whether these things that we encourage campaigns to do actually work. And then there was another response, which was more plentiful, which is, you know, oh no, academics have developed a scientifically credible tool for determining whether these things we get candidates to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on every year actually work. But in the first group, there was a small sort of cadre of folks, mostly at the permanent institutions of the left, labor unions, women's groups, environmental groups, who said, hey, this is pretty useful to us. We should be paying attention to what these academics and their sort of proteges learn in their experiments, but we're out doing politics every year and we should be running experiments of our own. And for the first time, we can have the confidence to know, even if it's you know, these really measuring these small discrete interactions, does a knock on the door make somebody more likely to vote than a robocall? For the first time, we can bring some empirical authority to bear on sort of this nuts and bolts political activity. And it's important to realize that that happened within these institutions, you know, like the AFL-CIO, which I think there's a caricature that sort of goes around about organized labor, that it's you know, sort of a backwards, practitioners of a sort of methodologically backwards politics. But the fact is the AFL spends a lot of money on campaigns every year and has every incentive to invest in research that could make them even 2 or 3 or 4% more efficient year to year. And they do a lot of the sort of nuts and bolts politics of knocking on doors and phone calls. And so figuring out how to most efficiently allocate those resources by testing what works and what doesn't is of great value to them. But there's no reason why a campaign manager for a candidate campaign should feel that way. The other big innovation that I write about in the book, it comes not from folks looking to the academic social sciences, but to the corporate world and to consumer research. And it became evident to people in politics around 2000 that corporate marketers knew a whole lot more about their customers than campaigns knew about the voters they were trying to reach. And it had become possible through changes in computing power and database architecture to link up voter files, you know, registration record databases with the sort of massive databases that private sector data warehouses had gathered initially to develop credit rating scores, and then became useful for direct mail vendors. And in so doing, you could run fairly sophisticated predictive models at the individual level. And this is what we call micro-targeting in campaigns, but the idea that instead of having to think about voters in terms of the very broad categories that show up on your voter registration record or in polls, your precinct or your gender or the you know, racial composition of your neighborhood or your party registration, now you can look at the interplay of hundreds, if not thousands, of individual variables and come up with individualized predictions of somebody's likelihood of voting, casting a ballot at all, or supporting a certain candidate, or having a position on a given issue. And this has radically changed how campaigns figure out who their targets are and disperse resources among them. And most of the work incubating this, the sort of investing in linking up these different databases, the sort of testing of it, wasn't taking place in candidate campaigns either. It was taking place, or not traditional candidate campaigns. You know, and the few places where we see this type of innovation aren't the candidate campaigns or the parties. And I think that this is one of the things that's really important to understand is there's an assumption that parties should be these sort of permanent institutions that do the sort of R&D for campaigns. And it turns out that parties are often as sort of transient or transitory as campaigns are. I think that RNC has had 5 chairmen in the last 6 or 7 years. Each of them has their own sort of short-term goals, which are making sure that they enter an election year with a lot of money on hand and satisfying a very small internal constituency. Don't really have a whole lot of incentive to invest long-term in sort of getting smarter, going out and spending money, taking people out of their normal program into a control group to actually test the effectiveness of their programs, to do things that might not yield votes this year anytime soon. The few times we've seen parties become, I think, dominant sources or hubs for sort of research and development are when there's an incumbent president in the White House and they basically are an adjunct of a 4-year presidential reelection campaign. And it's not a coincidence that the Bush campaign starting in 2001 and the Obama and the DNC attached to sort of Obama starting in 2009 became major innovators in both the use of data for micro-targeting and actually running these experiments using elections that nobody else was paying attention to. Republicans were working in judicial elections in 2001 and Obama in mayoral campaigns and congressional special elections to try things in the field in 2009. And in each of these cases, and the left has created a whole lot of sort of permanent institutions that do not have to be responsive or accountable to the sort of short-term expectations or incentives attached to the 2 or 4 year election cycle. And so I think the challenge for anyone who's trying to figure out how to make campaigns smarter is to, first of all, look at obviously at places outside politics, not just at sort of social science and academia or the corporate world, but look at places where other people are solving similar problems, and then figure out how to create sort of counter-cyclical institutions that can translate those insights into politics. The sort of worst thing about politics is having to win elections. Thank you.